There is a moment in every family, quiet, unexpected, and completely unplanned, where love decides to show itself without asking permission. It does not wait for the right lighting or the right camera angle. It does not wait for silence or for anyone to be ready. It simply arrives, and when it does, it changes everything around it. The people who witness it carry it with them for the rest of their lives. The people who are part of it rarely even know it happened. They are too busy living it. On the morning of May 6, 2023, one of those moments happened in front of the entire world, and the entire world stopped to watch. It was Coronation Day in the United Kingdom. King Charles III was set to be crowned on May 6, 2023, a date that had been set not long after his accession to the throne following the death of Queen Elizabeth II in September 2022. For the first time in 70 years, a new king was going to be crowned inside Westminster Abbey. The streets of London had been filling up since before sunrise. Millions of people had traveled from across Britain and from every corner of the globe to be part of this day. Hotels were full, parks were packed. The mall leading up to Buckingham Palace was a sea of faces, flags, and the quiet electricity that only comes when history is about to happen. Newsweek. But in the middle of all that pageantry, the golden carriages, the ancient rituals, the towering Gothic arches of one of the most famous churches in the world. It was one family that the cameras kept returning to. It was one family that the world kept watching, not because of their titles, not because of their crowns or their uniforms or the carefully pressed perfection of their ceremonial clothes, but because of something much simpler and much harder to fake. They looked like a real family trying to get through an extraordinary day together, and that, somehow, was the most extraordinary thing of all. Prince William, the Prince of Wales, arrived at Westminster Abbey that morning in full ceremonial dress. He wore the Order of the Garter robes, deep blue velvet with the ancient insignia of Britain's oldest order of chivalry sewn into the fabric. He was composed, steady, the way a man is steady when he knows that what he is about to do carries the weight of 1,000 years of history. He had spent weeks preparing for this day. He had rehearsed his role. He knew his lines. He knew exactly what was expected of him. But none of that preparation could have told him what it would feel like to walk into that abbey as a father, knowing that somewhere inside that ancient building, his 9-year-old son was already there, waiting, dressed in a crimson ceremonial tunic, ready to do something that no child his age had ever done before. Beside William walked Catherine, the Princess of Wales. She wore a gown of ivory silk crepe, elegant, considered, and deeply deliberate in its detail. Princess Charlotte wore an Alexander McQueen dress and cape in ivory silk crepe with embroidery featuring rose, thistle, daffodil, and shamrock motifs, representing the 4 nations of the United Kingdom. And Catherine's gown carried the same symbolic design, mother and daughter united in fabric and meaning without anyone needing to explain it. On her head, Catherine wore a diamond and silver headpiece, understated and luminous, catching the gray morning light in a way that made her look like she had stepped directly out of a painting. AOL. She walked calmly. She smiled at the people who lined the route, but those who watched her closely could see something underneath the composure. There was a particular alertness in her eyes, the kind that every parent knows. She was not just attending a coronation. She was also looking out for 3 small people who were somewhere in the middle of one of the most overwhelming events any of them had ever experienced. Princess Charlotte was 8 years old on that day. She arrived wearing a dress and cape of ivory silk crepe from Alexander McQueen, embroidered with rose, thistle, daffodil, and shamrock motifs, with a sparkly headpiece by Jess Collett x Alexander McQueen. She looked composed and ready. In many ways, she had been preparing for this kind of moment her whole life. Charlotte had grown up in front of cameras. She had attended the funeral of Queen Elizabeth II the previous September. She had already learned, at 8 years old, how to hold herself in public. She had the quiet poise of a girl who understood, in some way she could not yet put into words, that she was part of something much bigger than herself. AOL. But she was also still a big sister. And that meant that, as she walked into Westminster Abbey that morning, one of her primary concerns was the 5-year-old boy holding her hand. Prince Louis was the youngest, 5 years old. He wore an outfit made by Deja and Skinner, consisting of a Hainsworth Garter blue doeskin tunic with specially designed lace embellishments on the collar, cuffs, and fronts. He was the smallest person in that entire procession. He was also, without any question, the most unpredictable. AOL. Louis had a history. At the previous year's Platinum Jubilee, He had gone spectacularly viral for his expressions, yawning, pulling faces, covering his ears at the noise, looking thoroughly unimpressed by the entire proceedings while sitting next to his great-grandmother, Queen Elizabeth II, on the Buckingham Palace balcony. The internet had loved every second of it. He had already made headlines the summer before for getting bored during the Platinum Jubilee and making funny faces. And if Princess Charlotte was becoming the master of the side eye, Prince Louis was proving himself a master of the eye roll who loved showing that the third child is a wild card. She knows. And now here he was again, at another long, formal event, dressed in another elaborate outfit. Surrounded by more people, more cameras, more noise, and more ancient ceremony than almost anyone on Earth would experience in an entire lifetime. Charlotte held his hand protectively as they entered Westminster Abbey, gripping his fingers and leading him toward their seats. Not aggressively, not dragging him, just there. A hand that said, "I've got you, I know this is a lot, I'm right here." "Hello." That was the first moment the cameras caught, and it was already enough to break 1,000 hearts. The inside of Westminster Abbey on the morning of the coronation was unlike anything it had ever been in modern memory. Over 2,000 guests attended the official crowning ceremony. Heads of state, foreign royals, dignitaries, ambassadors, religious leaders, celebrities, charity workers, and ordinary people who had been selected from communities across the United Kingdom filled every available seat. The choir was in place. The Archbishop of Canterbury was prepared. Every detail of a ceremony that had been planned for over a year was locked, ready, waiting. Entertainment tonight. The King's procession into the Abbey was the moment the entire country had been building toward. And walking directly in front of King Charles, holding the back corner of the long red ceremonial robe that trailed behind him, was Prince George. 9 years old, the future King of England, the eldest grandson of the man being crowned. The boy who one day, in some distant, unimaginable future, would stand in this exact church and receive this exact crown himself. George wore a bright scarlet tunic detailed with gold lace trim and blue velvet cuffs, along with wool trousers and boots. He was the youngest of the pages of honor. The announcement that George would serve as page of honor had come from Buckingham Palace weeks before the ceremony, a break with tradition, since grandchildren of monarchs did not usually play official roles in coronations. The decision to include him had been deliberate. It was a way of bridging past and future, of making visible the line of succession that would carry the monarchy forward for generations. ABC 7. Today come. George was the youngest future monarch ever to play an official role in a coronation ceremony. And despite being 9 years old, surrounded by adults in elaborate costumes in a church full of 2,000 people, while hundreds of millions watched around the world, Prince George walked with a stillness and a seriousness that made watching people catch their breath. Deseret News. He did not look around nervously. He did not fidget or stumble. He was assigned the corner of the robe behind the king's right shoulder and immediately assumed his position. Despite being the youngest of the pages, he received universal praise for carrying out his duties with the poise and precision of a future king. Royal Central. His parents could not be beside him for that entrance. William and Catherine had their own place in the procession, their own role in the day. George had to do this part alone, or as alone as a person can be when surrounded by the whole weight of history and the eyes of the world. And he did it perfectly. In the pews, William watched his son process in. Whatever he was feeling in that moment, pride, awe, the vertigo of watching your child step into something enormous and carry it with grace, he kept it controlled. He was a man trained from birth to hold difficult emotions in public, but those who watched the footage closely enough could see something in his face during those few seconds. A softening, a recognition, the look of a father who sees, suddenly and clearly, that his son is more than he knew. Back in the pews where the family sat, Charlotte and Louis settled in beside their mother. And then the ceremony began. The coronation of King Charles III lasted nearly 2 hours. 2 hours is a long time for anyone to sit still in a formal setting. For a 5-year-old, it is approximately 14 years. Louis started out attentive enough. He sat beside his sister, occasionally whispering to her, occasionally looking up at the towering columns and the stained glass windows with the wide, frank curiosity of a small child encountering something genuinely too large to understand. At one point, he leaned over and pointed something out to Charlotte, and Charlotte leaned in close to listen, her face serious and interested, the way older siblings are when their little brother says something unexpectedly perceptive. "Hello." Kate watched both of them from the corner of her eye while keeping her face forward, composed, present. Princess Kate and Charlotte kept a watchful eye on Louis and comforted him at various points during the ceremony. She was doing what mothers do at events like this, holding the whole thing together by sheer attention. A gentle hand on Louis's shoulder when he started to wriggle. A look at Charlotte that said everything without saying anything at all. "Hello." And then, sometime in the middle of the ceremony, Louis needed a moment. At one point, Louis exited the ceremony for a brief moment before appearing again next to his father. Not dramatically, just a small boy who had reached the limit of what he could absorb in one sitting, slipping quietly out with the help of the adults around him, and then, equally quietly, coming back. Entertainment tonight. The world noticed, the world smiled, because the world recognized that moment too. Every parent who watched it understood it completely. Every person who had ever been a small child in a large, overwhelming, endlessly formal place understood it. There was no embarrassment in it. There was only the honest admission that some things are simply too big for small people to contain for very long. Coming back and meant sliding back into his seat next to his father, next to his sister, back into the fold of the family. And Louis did it with the uncomplicated ease of a child who knows, without having to think about it, that his people will always make room for him to return. That ease, that absolute certainty of belonging, was something that ran through everything the Wales children did that day. You could see it in the way Charlotte moved through the ceremony with the attentiveness of someone who understood her role. You could see it in the way George carried himself in those crimson robes, serious and steady. And you could see it in the way Louis existed in the middle of all of it, fully, completely, unself-consciously himself, because he had never been given any reason to be anything else. All the while, somewhere outside those walls, the crowds were growing. The people of Britain and the world were pressing closer to television screens, to phones, to park-erected big screens and pub windows and laptop computers in time zones where it was the middle of the night. They were watching this family. They were watching this day. They were watching 3 children in beautiful clothes sitting in one of the most magnificent buildings in the world, being exactly who they were, no more, no less. And what they were, it turned out, was exactly what the world needed to see. Not a symbol, not a performance, not the carefully managed image of an institution protecting itself from scrutiny. Just a father who couldn't stop glancing at his son in the crimson tunic. Just a mother whose eyes never stopped moving between her children. Just an 8-year-old girl holding a 5-year-old boy's hand because she knew he needed it. Just a 9-year-old walking into history because someone asked him to, and because he was not about to let anyone down. The coronation of King Charles III was an event of enormous historical weight. It was the crowning of a king. It was the formal passing of the monarchy from one generation to the next. It was a day that would be written about in history books for centuries. There were moments of profound ceremony. The anointing, the investiture, the crowning itself. The flash of St. Edward's crown catching the light inside the abbey in a way that made the whole church seem to hold its breath. But beneath all of that, quietly and persistently, and with no intention of calling attention to itself, something else was also happening. A family was having one of the most important days of their lives. A father was watching his father become king. A son was watching his grandfather be crowned. A mother was watching her children face a moment that would live in them long after they could remember the details. And 2 sisters and brothers were doing what siblings do, leaning on each other, nudging each other, holding each other's hands in the dark of a church full of the whole world's noise and light. The ceremony moved toward its most important moment. The Archbishop of Canterbury raised St. Edward's crown above the head of King Charles III. The ancient words were spoken. The crown came down. And outside in the streets, the crowd erupted. Inside the abbey, 2,000 people rose. The choir sang. The trumpets sounded. The sound rolled out of Westminster Abbey and across London and across the country and out into the world. And in a pew near the front of that great church, a 5-year-old boy looked up at the sound with wide eyes, and his big sister put her hand on his arm. And his mother looked over at both of them. And the Prince of Wales, the man who would one day wear that same crown, looked down the pew at his family, and something in his face said everything that words could not. The first part of this day was over, but the story was only just beginning. After the Archbishop of Canterbury placed St. Edward's crown on the head of King Charles III, the inside of Westminster Abbey transformed from a place of ceremony into a place of emotion. The ancient rituals had done their work. The words had been spoken. The oaths had been taken. The crown had found its head. And now, before the formal procession could begin again, before the golden carriages and the cheering crowds and the long march back through the streets of London, there was one more thing that had to happen inside those walls. Prince William had to kneel before his father. The homage of royal blood is one of the oldest traditions in the coronation ceremony. For centuries, it was the moment when the senior members of the royal family pledged their personal allegiance to the newly crowned king or queen, not as subjects, but as family. Blood pledging to blood, heir pledging to sovereign. William was the only person to kneel before Charles at this coronation, carrying out a pledge that echoed the same words Prince Philip had spoken to Queen Elizabeth II at her coronation in 1953. William rose from his place in the pew and walked forward. He walked past the rows of 2,000 guests, past the foreign dignitaries and the heads of state, and the representatives of a world that was watching through every screen and satellite it could find. He walked to the coronation chair, where his father sat wearing St. Edward's crown for the first time, wearing the robes of a king, looking at his son approaching with an expression that no crown can replace and no ceremony can manufacture. William held his father's hands and spoke the words of the pledge. I, William, Prince of Wales, pledge my loyalty to you and faith and truth I will bear unto you, as your liege man of life and limb. So help me God. NBC News. He said them clearly, he said them firmly, he said them the way a man says something true. After his pledge, William placed his hand gently on the crown and bent down to give his father a kiss on the cheek. And King Charles, visibly moved, whispered quietly, Thank you, William. Hello. The two words were barely audible. They were captured only because cameras were close enough and the Abbey was quiet enough and the moment was still enough that nothing could escape notice. But those two words, Thank you, William, carried more weight in that instant than most speeches ever do. They were not the words of a king to his heir. They were the words of a father to his son. The words of a man who had waited his entire adult life for this moment and who, now that it had arrived, wanted his son to know what his presence meant. In the pews, Princess Charlotte and Prince Louis were watching. Charlotte sat straight and attentive, her eyes on her father as he walked away from the coronation chair and came back to the family. Louis, who had been pulling faces and whispering questions to his sister throughout the morning, seemed in this moment to go unusually still, watching his father with the focused attention of a child who understands that something important just happened, even if he cannot yet explain what it was. Hello. And then William was back in the pew, back beside Kate, beside Charlotte, beside Louis, back in the fold of the family. He sat down and Kate looked at him, just looked at him, the way two people who have been through everything together look at each other when they have just come through something else, and the understanding that passed between them needed no translation. From somewhere in the third row of the Abbey, seated among the other non-working royals, Prince Harry watched this moment too. He was there, quiet, a little separate, present, but at a distance from the family he had once been at the center of. The relationship between William and Harry had been fractured in a very public way in the years leading up to this day. The stories of that fracture had been told and retold across newspapers and podcasts and streaming documentaries until the details had become almost too familiar to carry weight anymore. But in the Abbey, in the hush after William's pledge, the physical distance between the two brothers, visible to everyone watching, had its own kind of language. The day was not about that. The family was not letting it be about that. But it was there, in the room, the way complicated things always are in families, sitting quietly in a pew a few rows back from the people who had moved on without fully moving on. The ceremony continued. The Archbishop invited everyone inside the Abbey to speak the homage of the people, the first time in history that the public had been invited to pledge fealty to a new king. The sound of 2,000 voices filling that ancient space with the words of allegiance was something that those inside the Abbey described afterward as unlike anything they had ever experienced. The stone walls had heard a great deal in 900 years, but they had not heard this before. ABC News. Charlotte and Louis sang along to God Save the King and watched the program alongside their parents. Charlotte sang confidently, knowing the words, her voice joining the general sound of the abbey in the way of someone who has been taught that participation is a form of respect. Louis sang too, or made sounds that resembled singing, his mouth moving with more enthusiasm than accuracy, his head bobbing slightly in a way that was purely, helplessly, irresistibly him. Entertainment tonight. Kate caught it. She watched her youngest son singing the national anthem at his grandfather's coronation with the unself-conscious joy of a 5-year-old who simply does not know that there is any other way to do it. And her face did something that all the cameras caught, but none of them could fully explain. It was a look that lived somewhere between laughter and tears. The look of a mother who is simultaneously overwhelmed with love and fully aware that she cannot, in this particular church, in front of this particular audience, actually cry. She held it together. She always held it together. But that look was real, and the world saw it, and the world understood it, because it was the face of every parent who has ever watched their child do something small and perfect in the middle of something enormous. The formal part of the ceremony came to its close. The king and queen processed back out of the abbey, beginning the long journey back to Buckingham Palace in the gold state coach. A vehicle so ornate, and so heavy, and so thoroughly impractical, that it reportedly rides like sailing through rough seas, a detail that King Charles himself had mentioned in the lead-up to the coronation with the dry humor of a man who had learned to find the absurdity in the machinery of monarchy. And then it was the family's turn. George, Charlotte, and Louis joined the coronation procession back to Buckingham Palace, riding in a carriage alongside their parents, William and Kate. After hours of sitting still, of watching and listening and absorbing, and occasionally slipping out and singing along and holding hands and pointing at the ceiling. After all of that, the 3 children of the Prince and Princess of Wales climbed into a carriage and began the ride back through the streets of London. Good morning, America. The city was waiting for them. The mall was packed beyond any reasonable expectation of what packing could mean. People had been standing there for hours. Some had been there since the previous evening. They were pressed together behind barriers, flags in hand, phones raised, faces turned toward the street with the kind of focused hope that only happens when people are about to see something they have waited a very long time to see. They had watched the ceremony on the big screens. They had heard the announcement. They knew the crown had come down, and now they wanted to see the people who wore it or who would one day wear it. The carriages moved through the gates and into the crowd, and the sound that went up was the kind of sound that enters the body before it reaches the ears. It is not loud the way a concert is loud. It is loud the way weather is loud. It fills everything. It has no edge. Inside the carriage, 3 children experienced this sound from a very particular vantage point. George, who had spent the morning holding himself with the gravity of a future king, now allowed himself something closer to a smile. Louis was seen frowning and laughing at the carriage window while placing his hand on the glass, pressing his fingers against it, pulling faces, looking out at the crowd with wide eyes, and what appeared to be a growing appreciation for the fact that all these people were, at least in part, here for him. Fox News. Charlotte watched out her window too. She waved. She had the royal wave down already, that particular combination of precision and warmth, the hand turned just so, the motion steady rather than frantic, the attention distributed across the crowd rather than fixed on any single face. She was 8 years old and she had already figured this out. Princess Charlotte waved to the crowds during the coronation procession back to Buckingham Palace, riding in a carriage alongside her family. ABC 7. William and Kate sat with their children and let the moment happen. They waved too, of course. They acknowledged the crowd in the way they had been doing for years. But there was something different about this carriage ride, this particular procession through these particular streets. They were not just a couple fulfilling their public role. They were parents, sitting with their children, watching their children take in something that would become part of the foundation of who those children would be for the rest of their lives. You do not forget the day your grandfather was crowned King of England. You do not forget the feel of a carriage rolling through streets where thousands and thousands of people are cheering your name, or the name of your family, which by now has become, in ways you cannot yet separate out, also your name. You do not forget the sound of it. You carry it somewhere below the level of language for the whole of your life. George would know this better than anyone. He was old enough to understand, in a way that Louis was not yet, what this day meant for his own future. He had been chosen specifically for this ceremony because of what he represented, the continuation. The next chapter. The face that would one day look out from state portraits and stamps and coins, and all the quiet surfaces through which a monarchy makes itself visible to the world. He had been given a role in his grandfather's coronation so that the world could see the 3 generations of the line of succession standing together. Charles, William, George. Past, present, future. And he had carried that role. He had carried it with a grace that people across the world would talk about for days afterward. But sitting in the carriage with his family around him, and the crowds outside the window, and the day finally shifting from duty to something looser and warmer, George allowed himself, just briefly, to just be a boy coming home from a very long morning. The procession wound through the streets. The gold state coach, several carriages ahead, was already approaching the palace gates. The RAF flypast was being arranged for the balcony appearance that would close out the day. There was still more to come. But in the carriage, for a few minutes, there was just the family, 5 of them in one small moving space, the city moving past the windows, and the sound of the world welcoming them home. Kate leaned slightly toward her children. She said something to Louis that no microphone caught. He looked up at her and grinned, the wide, uncomplicated grin of a 5-year-old who is genuinely happy, and she smiled back at him. William, watching this from across the carriage, allowed himself a moment of something that was not quite relaxation but was adjacent to it. A loosening. A permission to feel, briefly, something other than the weight of the day. Charlotte, between them, rested her head lightly against her mother's arm for just a second. 1 second. The cameras may or may not have caught it, but it happened. The girl who had been composed and correct and perfectly poised for hours and hours simply leaned her head against her mother's arm for 1 second, because she was 8 years old and she was tired, and her mother was right there. That was the real coronation moment, not the crown, not the pledge, not the ancient words spoken beneath the soaring arches of Westminster Abbey. It was that. A child leaning on her mother in a moving carriage, knowing absolutely, without any doubt at all, that her mother would hold her up. The carriage passed through the palace gates. The cheering rose again, warmer and closer now, the crowd packed along every wall and railing of the forecourt. The family stepped out, and the day moved into its final chapter. The balcony appearance at Buckingham Palace after a coronation is one of those traditions so old and so deeply embedded in the national consciousness that it has become almost its own ceremony. The family appears. The crowds cheer. The RAF flies over. The king waves. The country exhales together, and in that collective exhale something is confirmed, that the continuity they were promised is real, that the institution is intact, that whatever else is uncertain in the world, this particular thing has happened as it was supposed to happen. The family walked out onto the balcony, and the sound from the mall was immediate and vast. There were so many people. There had been so many people all day in every direction, around every corner, but here, from the balcony, looking out over the long, straight stretch of the mall all the way to the Admiralty Arch, the sheer number of them became visible in a new way. This was not a crowd. This was a city's worth of people, all looking at the same place at the same time, all making the same sound. Louis looked out at them and appeared to arrive for the first time that day at genuine amazement. Not boredom, not confusion, not the carefully managed expressions of a child doing his duty. Genuine, wide-eyed amazement. He pressed forward toward the balcony railing and took it all in, the noise, the flags, the impossible number of faces. And for once, he seemed to have run out of commentary. Then the RAF flypast began. The red arrows crossed the sky above Buckingham Palace in a streak of red, white, and blue smoke, and Prince Louis lost his mind with joy. Not in a polite way, not in a restrained, palace-appropriate, we-are-aware cameras-are-watching way. In the loud, uncontrollable, completely authentic way that 5-year-old boys express delight when something is, in their considered judgment, the greatest thing they have ever seen in their entire lives. He was seen yelling in excitement on the balcony, waving with both hands and a pout on his face, and occasionally looking up and pointing at the royal jets that flew over Buckingham Palace. He pointed. He grabbed his mother's arm. He pointed again. He turned to Charlotte to confirm that she was also seeing this extraordinary thing happening in the sky above them, and Charlotte, who absolutely was seeing it, laughed at him with the helpless warmth of a sister who finds her little brother's joy deeply, genuinely funny. Kate was laughing too. She couldn't stop it. Even Prince William was trying to hold in a laugh as his youngest son displayed pure, unrestrained excitement on the balcony of Buckingham Palace. And there, in that moment, In the laughter of a mother and a father and a sister watching a 5-year-old boy discover what a military flypast feels like when you are standing on the balcony of Buckingham Palace and the whole country is cheering below you. There was something that the coronation ceremony, for all its ancient magnificence, could never quite produce on its own. There was life. Actual, unscripted, unmanaged, deeply human life. The kind that happens in every family, in every moment of joy, in every situation where something is simply too wonderful for small people to contain. The world had been watching this family all day, through the solemn procession into the abbey, through the 2 hours of ceremony and ritual and ancient Latin prayers, through the moment when William knelt before his father and said words that bound him to the crown for the rest of his life, through the carriage ride back through cheering streets, through the quiet moments between the formal ones, the hand-holding, the leaning, the glances, the whispered conversations between siblings in the pew. But it was this, Louis on the balcony, pointing at jets, grabbing his mother, turning to his sister, absolutely incandescent with the joy of it. That broke through every wall and every screen and every continent between the watching world and the family being watched. Because this was not a symbol of monarchy, this was a child at a party. And everyone who has ever loved a child recognized it immediately. As Charles and Camilla waved at the crowds, Prince Louis brought a moment of light-hearted fun to the pomp and circumstance by playing an imaginary piano on the balcony. He pressed his small fingers against the stone railing as if it were the keys of an invisible instrument, his face deeply serious and concentrated, as though the playing of this imaginary piano was genuinely the most important thing happening on this balcony at this particular moment. Charlotte watched him and bit her lip. Kate caught it and looked away for a second to compose herself. William shook his head in the way parents shake their heads when they have been defeated by love. "Good morning, America." The crowd below could not see the imaginary piano. They were too far away. They saw only a small boy with his hands on the railing, and they made of it whatever they could from that distance. But the cameras were close enough. The footage traveled instantly to every corner of the internet, and within hours it had become something that millions of people were sharing with the caption, "Same, honestly," or "This is me at every work event," or just, "I love this child." Because Louis, in playing that imaginary piano on the balcony of Buckingham Palace, while his grandfather was waved to by tens of thousands of people below, had done something that no official royal communications team could have planned, and no institution could have manufactured. He had made the monarchy feel like a family. George, standing a little further along the balcony, had been watching all of this with the expression of a 9-year-old who is very aware that his little brother is operating on a completely different frequency, but who is, underneath the carefully maintained composure, also quietly delighted by it. George laughed while on the balcony of Buckingham Palace, the seriousness of his morning role as page of honor finally giving way to something lighter. Hola. He had earned that laugh. He had spent the morning holding the king's ceremonial robe and walking through Westminster Abbey with the gravity of someone who understood the weight of what he was carrying. He had done it without stumbling, without faltering, without any of the visible uncertainty that might be forgiven in any 9-year-old placed in such an extraordinary situation. He had been, by every account, impeccable. And now he was on a balcony watching his little brother play an imaginary piano, and he was laughing, and it was perfect. William looked across at his children, at George laughing, at Louis gesturing at the sky, at Charlotte smiling her measured smile, and something in his face settled. The tension that had been visible in him all morning, the careful control of a man who understood that the eyes of the world were upon him, and that the weight of the day was real and enormous, it did not disappear entirely. It does not disappear entirely for men like William on days like this because the weight is always there, but it softened. It made room for something else. Kate beside him looked at her husband looking at their children, and she took the whole picture in. The crowd below, the sky above still streaked with the last of the flypast, the palace behind them, its rooms full of history so thick you could almost breathe it in, and her children in front of her, 3 extraordinary, ordinary, real and complicated and beloved children, being exactly who they were, on the biggest day any of them had ever experienced. She reached out just briefly and her hand found William's. A second, maybe 2, not a gesture for the cameras, not a performance of togetherness. Just a moment between 2 people who had built something together, and were standing, today, in the middle of what they had built. Below them on the mall, people were beginning to slowly filter away. The great convergence of the day was starting to disperse, back toward tube stations and train platforms and cars parked in distant suburbs, back toward hotels and rental flats and the long journeys home to cities and towns and countries far from London. They had seen what they came to see. They had been part of something. They carried it with them now, and they would carry it for a long time. But not everyone left immediately. Some stayed. They stood in the mall and looked up at the balcony even after the family had gone inside, as though the afterglow of the moment was still there, hovering in the air above the palace, not quite ready to dissipate. Inside the palace, the formal day gave way to something more private. The king and queen hosted a private lunch for members of the family, a rare moment of genuine togetherness behind closed doors, away from the cameras and the ceremony and the public gaze that had shaped every hour of the preceding day. Hello. The children ate. They talked. The formality of the morning dropped away in the way it always drops away when people who know each other well are finally allowed to just be themselves again. George, who had been a page of honor for the last several hours, was presumably allowed at some point over lunch to simply be a boy who had done a great job and was now very hungry. Louis, freed from the obligations of ceremony, presumably ate with the focused enthusiasm he brought to most things he actually wanted to do. Charlotte, somewhere between her brothers in energy and composure, watched everything and said the right things and also, very likely, finally exhaled. The long day continued to settle. The country, outside the palace windows, was doing the same. Across the United Kingdom, street parties that had been planned for months were in full swing. Gardens and cul-de-sacs and village greens were decorated with bunting. Neighbors who had not spoken much in years were sitting in garden chairs side by side, eating sandwiches and watching the coverage on outdoor screens. In pubs, people who had watched the ceremony in the morning were now on their second or third round, replaying favorite moments, agreeing and disagreeing about what had been most moving, most surprising, most worth remembering. In 1,000 living rooms, grandparents were telling grandchildren that they had watched the last coronation too, had been children then, had watched Queen Elizabeth II crowned in black and white on small television screens, had never expected to live long enough to see another one. And the grandchildren, who had just watched this one in color on large screens, and then immediately on their phones, listened politely to a story they were not quite old enough to fully understand. This is what coronations do. They create a shared before and after, a line across time that everyone alive can place themselves in relation to. I was here when this happened. I was this age. I was in this place. I felt this particular feeling. The feeling settles into memory and stays there, and years from now it will surface unexpectedly, triggered by a piece of music or a scrap of footage or the particular gray quality of a May morning sky. For 3 children in Buckingham Palace, the day was becoming memory even as it was still happening. This is the strange thing about days of great significance. They begin to accumulate their own history before they are over. While George, Charlotte, and Louis were still living it, they were also already beginning to remember it. George would remember the weight of the king's robe in his hands, the feel of the ceremonial gloves, the sound of the abbey filling with music as they processed down the nave. He would remember standing at the corner of his grandfather's robe and knowing, with a clarity that he might not have been able to articulate, but that was no less real for that this was something he would carry for the rest of his life. He would remember looking up at some point in the ceremony and seeing his father's face. And he would remember what he saw there. Charlotte would remember the ceremony with the clear, careful attention she brought to everything. She would remember sitting between the ceremony and her brother, belonging completely to both, managing both with a grace that 8-year-olds are not supposed to have, but that she, somehow, had always had. She would remember her mother's look, the one that said everything without saying anything. She would remember the feeling of leaning against her mother's arm in the carriage, just for a second, and the solidity of what she found there. Louis would remember, in the way that 5-year-olds remember things, which is to say not in sequence and not in detail, but in impressions and feelings and flashes of pure sensation, the noise. The incredible, overwhelming, magnificent noise, the crowd. The jets, the balcony, the imaginary piano that he played on the railing while hundreds of thousands of people stood below him and the red arrows streaked through the sky. He would not remember it the way historians would remember it. He would remember it the way joy is remembered, not as a story, but as a warmth, a brightness, a feeling that returns without warning and that says, that was real, that happened, that was mine. In the weeks after the coronation, footage of the family's moments that weekend went viral repeatedly. Their warmth, their connection, their visible love for each other becoming the images that people returned to again and again when they thought about what the day had meant. Newsweek. This was not an accident. It was not manufactured. It was not the product of a communications strategy or a carefully managed media plan. It was the result of three children being genuinely themselves in an extraordinary situation, held steady by parents who loved them and knew them and made space for all of it. The gravity and the silliness, the ceremony and the yawning, the moment of historical weight and the moment of the imaginary piano. William and Kate had made a particular kind of choice in how they raised their children. It was a choice that had been visible in small ways for years. In the school runs where William stood in the rain with the other parents. In the holiday photographs on the beach where the children were just children. In the interviews where both parents talked about the importance of their children having as normal a life as possible, of understanding both where they came from and who they simply were. That choice was visible in a very specific way on May 6, 2023. What the world saw on the balcony of Buckingham Palace was not a royal family performing unity. It was an actual family being unified. The difference between those two things is everything. One is a production, the other is a life. And what the Wales family had built, in the houses and the schools and the holidays and the ordinary days that nobody photographed and nobody filmed, all of it was visible, suddenly and completely, in the way those three children moved through their grandfather's coronation. They were secure, they were loved, they knew who they were, and they knew that whatever happened, whatever the day required of them, whatever history asked them to carry, the person next to them would be there. George knew it when he walked into that abbey alone with the king's robe in his hands and looked up to find his parents watching. Charlotte knew it when she took Louis's hand at the entrance and held it all the way to their seats. Louis knew it when he slipped out of the ceremony and came back to find his family exactly where he had left them, making room for him without comment. And William knew it, perhaps most of all, perhaps with the most complicated mixture of feelings, when he rose from the coronation chair after pledging his allegiance to his father and walked back to the pew where his family was waiting and sat down and was home. The coronation ended, the day ended, the coverage ended, the crowd dispersed, the streets emptied, the flags came down from the windows, London returned, gradually and imperfectly, to the rhythms of an ordinary week. But the moment on the balcony, Louis and his imaginary piano, Charlotte laughing, George finally letting himself laugh too, Kate and William standing with their children at the front of the palace while the country they would one day lead cheered below them, that moment did not end. It traveled. It crossed oceans and time zones and languages. It appeared on screens in countries that had no particular stake in the British monarchy, but that had a very human stake in the sight of a family that was genuinely, visibly, irreducibly a family. And in that small, unscripted, completely authentic moment, something happened that the grandest ceremony in the world cannot guarantee and the most elaborate ritual cannot produce. People fell in love with them, not with their titles, not with the crown or the palace or the ancient weight of the institution they represented. With them, this specific family, these specific children, this particular way of being together in the middle of something enormous and remaining, somehow entirely themselves. William and Kate had given their children many things. They had given them history and heritage and a place in the longest continuing story of any nation on earth. They had given them duty and discipline and the knowledge that what they carried mattered and that how they carried it mattered too. But they had also given them something else, something rarer and more valuable than any of it. They had given them each other. And on the day that a crown was placed on the head of a king, in front of the whole watching world, three children stood on a balcony in the wind and the noise and the impossible beauty of that day, and they were together. And the world looked up at them and felt something it had not expected to feel. It felt like family. It felt, against all the odds, like home.